today I want to take you through the story of one of my clients who had been suffering from plantar fasciitis for years, not weeks, not months, years. She'd seen multiple physiotherapists, a couple of sports masseuses, I think even osteopath, but despite following their advice, which was pretty much to rest and massage the plantar fascia, nothing was working. In fact, the pain actually began to get worse. But then she met me. Now, I'm not special. There are literally thousands of physiotherapists all around the world just like me, with the same training, the same ideas, the same outlook. But what we do differently perhaps to the majority of the physiotherapists out there, we read the research, we look into the up-to-date science, up-to-date evidence about different pathologies and how we can effectively assess and treat them. And the second thing that we do is we take a step back. We appreciate that pain is just a symptom of an issue, and we need to understand why that issue is developed in the first place. Often it's because something has been overloaded, because something else isn't doing its job. So if we look above and below the joint, above and below the area of pain, we can usually work out what isn't doing its job, correct that, and that will help deload or reduce the amount of load going through the painful area. And that's where biomechanics come in, where movement strategies come in. Because if we can understand if we're moving suboptimally, we can begin to appreciate why pain may have developed. And that is where ankle dorsiflexion comes in as my number one biomechanical deficiency that can lead to a plantar fasciitis. So naturally, that's what me and my client looked at first. And guess what? She had a huge restriction there. Huge. Now, to assess this, we used a well-known and quite famous test called the knee-to-wall test. For the purposes of this video, this is being performed at a side profile so you can see what's going on. But at home, you'll be looking at a wall, your foot or your big toe up against the wall, and you're going to bend your knee towards the wall. Now, I want you to repeat that process each time you successfully tap the wall with your knee, moving your foot half a centimetre away. When you can no longer do that without the heel raising up, that's you done. And essentially I want you to record the distance between the wall and your big toe. And all you need for that is a ruler and a wall. Now with this test, any of my clients who wish to return to running need to hit a minimum of 10 centimetres. Now don't get me wrong, there's nuances there. There's certain people who may or may not be able to get into that range ever. And that becomes quite apparent quite quickly. So if you do have a limited ankle range of motion, it's definitely worth being seen by a good physio or a good GP or a good doctor to assess whether or not you potentially have the capacity to get back to 10 centimetres. And if you don't, there's a few other things that we can do to help you there. But for most people, at least 10 centimetres, especially for those who want to return to running, is what we're trying to achieve with this test. Now back to my client. Now, as I mentioned, she had a huge restriction in her plantar fasciitis ridden ankle. She actually only had a 2 centimetre knee to wall, which is quite poor. But not only that, she was feeling a bit of a pinch at the front of the ankle, which again suggests suboptimal mechanics, which could be causing a bit of a restriction in the ankle and causing an ankle impingement, which can again cause a few other issues, i.e. anterior or front of ankle pain. Now interestingly, this tied in with her past injury history. Now if your physiotherapist doesn't deeply dive into your past injury history, not just medical history, but injury history, run away. Because they need to understand your previous injuries to understand why you're moving the way you are now, and ultimately how we can correct that. So we came to understand that she'd had previous multiple ankle sprains, and what happens when we sprain our ankle? As a protective mechanism, the brain will try and restrict range of motion at the ankle because it's a bit silly, it thinks that's going to prevent you from rolling it again. But unfortunately that can cause other issues in the future. But ultimately, yeah, a natural consequence of an ankle sprain is that the ankle will get a bit restricted, especially into ankle dorsiflexion. So we'd established a key biomechanical deficiency that's potentially led to her plantar fasciitis. And unbelievably, not a single one of her previous therapists had actually looked into this. They'd not even performed this test, which is widely used, it's pretty famous, it's pretty well researched, yet none of them used it. And it was such a simple low-hanging fruit that they could have probably spent a few weeks treating, either with hands-on therapy, which we don't necessarily need, or just giving some basic exercises, which we'll get to later, which could have fixed this, or at least fixed this deficiency, which could potentially have fixed or reduced the symptoms of her plantar fasciitis. So our intention over the next couple of weeks was to address this, to try and increase this ankle dorsiflexion. Now no rolling of the foot on a ball, no massage, no silly ankle supports. We literally just used a couple of exercises, and I'll be getting to those in a little bit. And then there was a glimmer of hope. Now, one of the big things that we see with the plantar fasciitis is morning pain. As you take those first few steps in the morning, it's usually the most painful, and it tends to settle down a little bit during the day. When she came back to see me, just 2 weeks later, just daily exercises aimed to improve her ankle dorsiflexion, she came back with reduced plantar fascia pain in the morning. Now don't get me wrong, it wasn't completely eliminated. Treating a plantar fasciitis is a marathon, not a sprint, but really positive signs quite early on. But not only that, we actually managed to increase her ankle dorsiflexion to 6 centimetres in just 2 weeks with just 10 minutes of exercise a day. And for the first time in years, she actually started to feel there was a bit of a light at the end of the tunnel, that she'd felt a tangible improvement, and she was actually getting quite positive about her outlook.
Pretty good.
Now obviously 6 centimetres isn't perfect, it's not ideal, but it's definitely a big improvement, and it shows that we've got scope for further potential improvement. And therefore we decided to give it another couple of weeks. We progressed the exercises slightly, we changed a few things, a bit the durations, the repetitions, the sets, and we decided to have another good go, another couple of weeks to see if we can get any more. Now if we fast forward 2 weeks, we hit 8 centimetres, and again her pain had dropped again. When she first came to see me, she suggested a pain on a scale of 0 to 10, 10 being the worst pain imaginable, 0 being no pain at all, was around the 6 or 7 mark in the mornings. Now at this point, 4 weeks on, she was getting down to a 1 or 2 out of 10 in the morning. A huge change in her symptoms, and during the day she was actually having periods where there was no pain at all. Now because she wasn't a keen runner and she wasn't really bothered about ever having to run again, we decided that 8 centimetres was probably sufficient for her. Now again, I want to go back. For most people who run, I would advise, and the research strongly supports this, a minimum of 10 centimetres ankle dorsiflexion on the knee to wall test. But this has to be specific to you. If you don't want to run, if you don't want to go back to any sort of multi-direction sport, you will get away with less than 10 centimetres. And 8 centimetres, in my opinion, was close enough, especially as we were starting to see a reduction in her pain experience. Now what we did at this point, we started to look at a couple of other biomechanical deficiencies. Now I'm not going to go into those today. I wanted to really sort of focus our attention on ankle dorsiflexion, how we can assess and treat it today. But if you subscribe and check back in the next couple of days, you'll be able to see those other biomechanical deficiencies that can lead to a plantar fasciitis. As I mentioned before, we literally used 2 exercises to improve this ankle dorsiflexion, and we're going to go through them now. Now when we have reduced ankle dorsiflexion, it can be for 2 main reasons. Now the first one is that the calves, which are essentially the muscles that prevent ankle dorsiflexion, are a little bit tight, a little bit restricted, and they're not allowing that range of motion. The second one is that the actual joint itself is stiff and is not allowing optimized kinematics of the joint to allow sufficient ankle dorsiflexion to occur. Or in most cases, it's a combination of both. Simply, if the joint's stiff, the muscles are going to shorten. If the muscles have shortened, the joints are going to get a bit stiff. So we decided to attack this client's rehab with 2 exercises. There was 1 going to address the issue of the calf being tight, and 2 going to address the issue of the ankle not moving optimally. With this exercise, rather than giving her specific sets, I simply asked her to accrue 4 minutes of end range stretching a day. She could break it down into 20-second chunks if she liked, but she had to spend 4 minutes a day in this end range. Now next up, we spent a little time mobilising the joint, and for this we used a band to help mobilise a bone called the talus, and here's why that's important. Exercise, we can see that the band is pulling back relative to the foot. Now if you can see where the band's actually located, just under the sticky out bone of the ankle, and as we move our knee forward, the band is pulling backwards on that bone, which is called the talus, and that mimics the movement that we need the talus to do. Whenever the knee comes forward relative to the foot, we're going into ankle dorsiflexion, and to do that we need the talus to move backwards, and the band is essentially pulling on that to mimic that movement, to restore that movement and free up the ankle.